only descendant of Christian Haldy in this. There are a million of them. But I did grow up with my Haldy grandmother, my Haldy Oma, living upstairs in our house. And once when I was maybe about 12 years old, somewhere in there, she called me upstairs. She said she wanted to tell me about an old ancestor, Christian Haldy. Now, I remember her being quite earnest, and I can't help but think I wasn't as earnest as maybe I should have been. But she read me this quotation from Gottlieb Scheiner's Inspirations history. Basically, that's all she could tell me about Christian Haldy. That he used to be a minister, a Lutheran minister in Germany, and he died when he fell out of a plum tree. So over the years, his name came up every now and then, usually in a genealogical context. And I would sometimes wonder, why would a Lutheran minister join the Inspirationists? But mostly I wondered, what was he doing in that plum tree? Well, thanks to the records and the documents that we have in the church archives and in the Amana Heritage Museum, I've been able to find out answers to those questions. And I think those answers would even surprise my Haldy Oma about who this guy was and why he started this journey to the Inspirationists. And I want to share his story, not so much because of his experience in his life some 300 years ago, but I really found that in learning about him, I learned a whole lot more about our church and our community. And so I'd like to share that with you. Christian Haldy was born about 1701 to Martin Christian Haldy and Anna Maria Charlotta Eichhartz. R.C. would say it could be Eichhacker, but it's Eichhartz, I think. And it was in a fairly well-to-do family. The family had come from Switzerland. They settled in Saarbrücken, which is in the Pfalz, west of the Rhine in Germany. And his father had a really good position as a church warden in that town. So they were fairly well-to-do. In fact, they were well-to-do enough so that Christian was able to study in Geneva, and he received a theological degree in theology at Heidelberg. In 1727, then, after he finished his studies, he was appointed the Pfarrer, or the minister of the Lutheran Church in Billigheim. And that's a photo of the chancel of the church in Billigheim, the Lutheran Church, where Christian Haldy spent some 20 years as minister in that church. He then married Marie Helena Killian in 1729, and they had several children. I haven't nailed that down exactly yet. It looks like about 3 boys and 3 girls. They had many generations since then and many children in each generation. So that family tree spreads out really quickly. And if you look at the Amana Family Tree website, which is another fantastic resource, and the people who have done that should be commended as well. It's really great. If you look at the Amana family tree, you'll find a Christian Haldy descendant hanging on almost every branch. Seriously. I'll have to ask Lothar to do the statistics sometime. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Christian Haldy descendants.
Maybe that's due to the plum tree.
So, how did he get to the community? I was able to find the first mention to Christian Haldy in a diary by Paul Nagel. I'm going to mention his name a lot, and unfortunately I can't tell you about him now, but next week I will. Paul Nagel is a very important person. After the death of Rock and Gruber, he really took on a leadership role, and I would argue if not for him, we wouldn't be here today, really. So I'm going to refer to Nagel's diary because that's where I found lots of information about Christian Haldy. The first mention is on 20 February 1746. And Nagel mentions that he visited Pfarrer Haldy in Billigheim, and that Pfarrer Haldy told him about how he had met the Inspirationists. Now, we don't know exactly where Haldy first met the Inspirationists, but Billigheim is right here a little bit south of Landau. Here's the Rhine River. We're talking about the Pfalz area, which is the Rhine-Palatinate, that's called today. It's west of the Rhine. There's Saarbrücken, and then France is down in here. So it's right on the border between France and Germany. Now, Landau and Billigheim are very close to Inspirationist congregations. There was one in Berchtesgaden, Annweiler, Kusel. There's also Grumbach, Kaiserlautern, lots of Inspirationist settlements there. And Rock was very active in the 1730s, giving testimonies in those areas. We don't know if Haldy ever heard a testimony by Rock, but he certainly would have heard about him because of all the action. 1730s was very, very busy time for the Inspirationists in the Pfalz area. Now, Nagel said that Haldy told him that a brother, one of the Inspirationists that had been in one of these congregations, had encouraged him to leave his ministerial post and join the community. But Haldy at the time just couldn't do that, he said, and he had some concerns. His main concern was he wondered, now, when I read these two concerns in the diary here, it made me stop and think, and I'll come back to them. But he had two concerns. One was, why do you call each other brother? And why do you let unruly children and sleeping old men in your prayer gatherings? Those are not really the questions I was expecting. So that I'll talk about that a little bit more. But Nagel answered those questions, and Nagel makes a point of saying he did not ask these questions to be confrontational or argumentative, but he was sincerely wondering about them. And then because of bad weather, Nagel notes in his diary, he stayed a few days longer. And knowing Nagel, he and Haldy had many conversations along those lines. So the second mention is actually in a testimony book on 13 November in 1747, that in the introduction to that testimony, it says that Haldy and 3 others came from Billigheim all the way up to Gelnhausen, where Rock was living at the time. And that's a long way. I mean, Nagel must have convinced Haldy, his answers to Haldy's concerns must have been convincing enough that he maintained an interest, because he went from Billigheim all the way up to Gelnhausen, which is probably about 120 miles. It's not a short journey. Gelnhausen, in fact, is just a little bit, there's the Ronneburg Castle. Gelnhausen is over to mainly to the east and a little south, probably about 8 or 10 miles from Ronneburg. And right next to Gelnhausen is a town of Lieblos, and that's where Haldy ended up dying. We'll get to that later. There was another testimony then about a year later where, again, Haldy came all the way up from Billigheim up to Gelnhausen, and another testimony was delivered with Haldy present. Okay, well, luckily they recorded who was present so that we know he was there. So he was definitely interested. And then in the spring of 1748, Paul Nagel and Jonas Wickmark, who was also another important person, came to the Pfalz region again. They had an extended visit there. Haldy accompanied them from village to village, and Haldy even helped do some of the prayer gatherings, help oversee some of the prayer gatherings. So he was definitely getting close to joining. And then in October of 1748, he did make the move and moved his whole family from Billigheim to Gelnhausen, up to be near Rock. And it was an opportune time because Rock died just a few months after that. So he came to Gelnhausen at that time. So we can ask, why did he make that move? Well, for one thing, he was encouraged to, and you could even say he was recruited to. Nagel, between his visits, kept up a correspondence with him. We have letters back and forth where Nagel is keeping him informed of what's happening in the community and still saying, all right, are you ready to make the move? Are you ready to do it? And he kept up that correspondence. He was actually, the congregations, the communities at Grumbach and Kuzel sent him a scarf, sent Haldy a scarf to keep him warm as a gift. And Haldy wrote a thank you note. Here's Haldy's note, thank you note, and here on the bottom, it was addressed to Nagel. Here at the bottom, Nagel notes that Haldy was so thrilled with this gift that he wrote this thank you note, and it's actually in rhyme, if you look. So he wrote a poem in rhyme thanking him. He was also recruited directly by Johann Friedrich Rock. This is a letter by Rock, again in rhyme, and if you look at the title, it says, Jesus sei dein Mann, Haldy, fang dem an. Okay, which, Jesus is your man, Haldy, grab onto him. Okay, and that's the title of the letter, and then it's written in rhyme, and all of it is encouraging Haldy to come and join Rock in Gelnhausen. And those testimonies that I showed you were directly encouraging the same thing, saying, come follow Jesus, come to the community and follow Jesus. But then, of course, none of this would have had any effect if Haldy didn't have an issue with his church already. Okay, he had to be disaffected from the church. He'd been a minister there for 20 years. He wasn't going to just drop what he was doing and leave that nice chancel. That looked like a really nice church, you know, on a whim. He must have had some issues. And luckily for us, again, Paul Nagel records those issues. He had a conversation with Haldy and recorded his experience in a diary entry in February of 1728. And there it is. The local church authorities had complained to the higher authorities about Haldy's visits to the brethren and to the brothers, and that he was hanging out with them. Okay, and Haldy also had expressed some reservations about the Lutheran doctrine of communion, and so because of that, he was suspended from his post. Okay, he was his post as far as minister of that church was taken away from him. And a vicar was appointed, a substitute was appointed to take his place, which was okay. That would have maybe been okay. But Haldy was responsible for paying the vicar and actually housing him in his own house. Okay, so that was part of the punishment. And then if that wasn't bad enough, Nagel notes that this vicar, der seinen ältesten Tochter zu Fall bringen wollte. Okay, this vicar was hitting on Haldy's eldest daughter. Okay, so he was getting a little bit upset, I would guess. And Haldy also began to hold prayer gatherings in his own house. And the people who attended were arrested, and he notes thrown into prison with the riffraff, with all the riffraff. Haldy appealed to higher authorities. He finally got the people released from jail, but then he had to pay a fine of 300 gulden, which I can't tell you exactly what the equivalent of that is, but it's probably a couple years of his salary. And in order to make it good, they put a lien on his property. Okay, so Haldy then appealed to the prince. The prince said, all right, we'll get everybody released. We'll get rid of this bad vicar. Vicar, actually the word Nagel uses is vicarious. I kind of like that. But we'll get rid of this bad vicar, and we'll put a new one in, and we'll have him stay somewhere else, and you no longer have to take care of him. You're no longer responsible for him. But he still was suspended, and he still had to pay the fine. So you can see that the church's response to Haldy's concerns or disaffection really didn't help keep Haldy there. So while the Inspirationists were pulling him towards them, the church was in effect pushing him out. And it's fairly easy to see how that happened. Now, once he came to Gelnhausen, once he was in Gelnhausen, he became a real serious community member. And in fact, he became an elder in the community. He presided over the prayer meetings. He participated in conferences of elders. He oversaw some of the spiritual examinations, and we have all records of this in the archives that Emily was talking about. And he quickly tuned into that Inspirationist love of rhyming and poetry. Here he wrote, it's a contemplation on Psalm 42, okay, with my tears are my sustenance day and night, that verse. And Haldy wrote, he wrote in rhyme a contemplation on that. And he also presided over weddings in the community. And this is a record of one of the weddings he did. And again, just to show you, and he's not alone in this, it's something that we don't talk about in the Inspirations a lot, but they loved words. They loved poetry and rhyming. So he did an entire church service, and it's recorded here. It's all in rhyme. Okay? You can't really call it poetry, but it's in couplets. Every two lines rhyme. He also, was tuned into the wider Inspirationist network. We have a letter, here's a letter by J.A. Gruber and Gruber's kids addressed to Haldy. And the thing is, of course, Haldy never met J.A. Gruber. He was long in America by then, but they're still corresponding. So he really did, I guess you could say, dive into that Inspirationist membership and became a real community member. And in fact, he was one of the first community members in 1752. They were expelled from Gelnhausen, and the community had to move to Lieblos, which luckily was only 2 miles away or so. And he was one of the first to move to Lieblos. And he was not one of the first, he was the first to die in Lieblos. In 12 October 1754, he died. And this is an account, it's a report on Haldy's last hours, Christian Haldy's last hours. It describes how he fell out of the tree and what happened afterwards. And luckily, again, because of Paul Nagel, we have even more detail than here, because Nagel recounts exactly what had happened. And in fact, in these last hours, we get the answer. Why was he in that plum tree? That's the plum tree. It's because he had bought the plums. He was a brandy maker. Okay, he was a brandy maker. He had purchased the plums to make brandy. Nagel makes a point of saying he had tried to find someone else to pick them, but he couldn't, so he had to go pick them himself. And then it gets into real good detail. A branch broke, he fell, He caught himself on another branch, but that also broke. And he came down so hard on the pavement that he broke his leg so badly that the bone stuck through the skin. He also had internal and head injuries. Okay? They hauled him onto a wagon. They got him onto a wagon and got his leg set and everything and thought he was doing okay. But then they realized the injuries were more extensive than they thought. He lingered for about 10 days, and Nagel points out that he was lucid until the end. But the end came on 12 October 1754. If they didn't use epitaphs, of course, back then, but we could give him one. It says, "Here lies Christian Haldy. He gave up a plum job for a plum tree." Oh, you gotta give me that, okay? So, what can we take away from Christian Haldy's story here? The first lesson is obvious. Don't be climbing in a plum tree when you're over 50. And I can guarantee you'll never find me in one. Now, an apple or a pear, maybe, but not a plum tree. The second thing that struck me was that it shows one of the problems John Bendorf and I encountered when we were working on our archive webpage. One of the things we wanted to do was have a working list of people, of names of people who had been inspirationists in the 18th century. So we started a nomen register. And we're listing people that we came across in various sources. It goes on past there, but we've got about 10 different sources. If there's an X there, that means we found them in that source. So it made us realize that it was difficult to determine who was a member or not. Excuse me. I haven't talked this much in probably 10 years. It was difficult to determine who was a member. For one thing, we kind of thought, well, if it says Bruda Haldy, that means they were a member. Well, we soon realized that that's not the case. I mean, because Haldy was referred to as Bruda Haldy even in those testimonies well before he joined the Inspirationists. Once he got to Gelnhausen, we could say, yes, Haldy was a member, but it's just difficult to determine membership. In communal Amana, it was a formal agreement. People joined. There was the communal Amana was incorporated. There was a contract between the organization and the individual. You knew who a member was. By that contract, you knew if they were living there and attending church, they were a member. But in these diverse and less formal 18th century communities, it's very difficult to say, who was a member and who wasn't. Membership in 18th century was loose and fluid. People came and went. Not every member had a Gemeinde to be a member of, had a community to be a member of. And a lot of the prayer gatherings had guests and visitors of sincere people, but wouldn't have called themselves members. So it was you couldn't really say, who's a member and not. But we have completed a database here. We have about 1,650 names on there now of people that we know are at least very, very certain that were members of the community. So now we need to ask, what was it about the Inspirationists that attracted somebody like Haldy? Somebody who was disillusioned with the church that they were in. Why would the Inspirationists appeal to them? So let's go back to the questions. These are Haldy's first questions to Nagel. Why do you call each other brother? That first question is, I think, the key and gives a clue to why he was drawn to the Inspirationists. when I read that, my first thought was, well, wouldn't he ask about inspiration? Wouldn't he say, hey, what's all this Werkzeug stuff? What's all this inspiration stuff? He never talks about inspiration. For Haldy, it seems like that was just a given. He accepted it as true and godly, and I found no discussion about it anywhere. So if it isn't inspiration, and I don't think it was, then what was it? Again, I think it's that first question. I think the inspiration has offered a place to those seeking a true spiritual community, following that Philadelphian ideal of brotherly love, a brotherhood or community of love where all are bound in Christ. It's a central theme in pietism, and it's a central theme in many of the pronouncements of the Werkzeug, that search for community. Now, certainly the main theme of the Werkzeug testimonies is salvation, right? The path to salvation. Well, I think there's no doubt that a path to salvation for many of the Inspirationists led through community. The 24 rules, our 24 rules are all about it. J.A. Gruber undertook ecumenical efforts in America. I think that's what it's all about. And again, if you look at Nagel's diary, I think he succinctly states it here. The important thing is to build communities, to unite the members in love so that all should become one in Christ. For this purpose and end, the Lord sent his divine Spirit to be among us. Okay, so it's, again, the Werkzeug, inspiration, is a means to that end. It isn't the end itself. And I think certainly the community of true inspiration encouraged folks who were looking for that true community, like Haldy, I think. If you look at some of the quotations in those testimonies that were delivered in Haldy's presence, it's clear to me, I think. That is why I seek to establish a true spiritual community, so that each soul may find life through tidings of peace and goodwill. You can read those other ones. That was the theme of those testimonies that Haldy listened to. And then, this is the end of Rock's letter, that one that it said, where I showed you at the beginning, where Haldy, fang de man. This is the end, and if you look at the last verse, those plums are everywhere. If you look at the last verse, it's basically saying Rock is saying, read this, read the sixth collection of testimonies, and you'll see our love. I greet you as your servant in true brotherhood. Okay? And then Jonas Wickmark adds a P.S. and says, Jonas also greets you in true brotherly love. I think that sums it up. Okay? That's how they're communicating with Haldy. I think the message is clear. It says, Haldy, come join a true Christian brotherhood. Haldy's second question was about the Versammlung, and I don't have time to talk about that now, but I'll talk about it next week when I talk about Nagel, because that really comes through loud and clear with P.G. Nagel. So finally, and here comes the plums, I think Haldy's story gives us a rare glimpse into the lives of those ordinary people who made up the community of true inspiration, not just the founders or the leaders. And also, I think it's important because even though Haldy's journey was a spiritual one, we get to see the secular side as well, the worldly side. Pietists generally, and the Inspirations in particular, de-emphasize the material world and felt that it was the inner spiritual life that's important. But Haldy had to deal with the real world, with the secular world. The financial burden of the vicars and his fines, the concern for his friends who were arrested, the concern for his daughter. And he needed to support himself. So he started making brandy and climbed a plum tree. Okay? So most importantly, I think, Christian Haldy's story reminds us that history is not about theology and churches or social and economic systems or politics and government. It's about people who aren't much different from us. Thank you.